It's Encounter on VOA News Now. Encounter on VOA News Now brings together advocates and opponents debating the critical issues of our time in a freewheeling, no-holds-barred discussion of fact and opinion. With today's guests and the topic for Encounter, here's Carol Castiel.
Welcome to Encounter on VOA News Now. It was meant to be a fence-mending visit designed to improve U.S.-Israel relations after a year of friction. Instead, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden's trip to Israel last week was overshadowed by a diplomatic uproar caused by the Israeli announcement of plans to build 1,600 units of housing in East Jerusalem, which Palestinians want as the capital of their future state. Israel's latest building plans came just as the Palestinians had reluctantly agreed to resume indirect U.S. brokered talks in the coming days after a 14-month deadlock. The announcement angered Vice President Joe Biden, who condemned the action, saying it undermined the trust needed to jumpstart indirect talks.
It's incumbent on both parties to build an atmosphere of support for negotiations and not to complicate them. Yesterday, the decision by the Israeli government to advance planning for new housing units in East Jerusalem undermines that very trust, the trust that we need right now in order to begin as well as have profitable negotiations.
Later in the week, in a speech at Tel Aviv University, Vice President Biden defended Washington's right to give Israel constructive criticism on its policy, saying that sometimes only a friend can deliver the hardest truth.
Some of you legitimately may have been surprised that such a strong supporter of Israel for the last 37 years and beyond, but 37 years as an elected official, how I could speak out so strongly, given the ties that I share as well as my country shares with Israel. But quite frankly, folks, sometimes only a friend can deliver the hardest truth.
Despite Arab anger over Israeli plans to build housing in East Jerusalem, the U.S. State Department said it believes that indirect Israeli-Palestinian peace talks will still be held. U.S. Middle East envoy George Mitchell is due in the region next week to seal plans for the so-called proximity talks. So what are the prospects of a peace process getting back on track? For insights and analysis, we turn to two regional experts. Dr. Ziad Asali is a medical doctor and president of the American Task Force on Palestine, a Washington-based nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to a two-state solution, and Ambassador Philip Wilcox. He's president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, an organization devoted to fostering peace between Israelis and Palestinians, also based in Washington. And during his more than 40-year career as a U.S. diplomat, Ambassador Wilcox served in numerous senior posts, among which Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Middle Eastern Affairs. He also served as Chief of Mission and U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem. And both gentlemen join me here at the VOA Broadcast Center in Washington. Welcome to you both.
Good to be with you, Carol.
And Ambassador Wilcox, let me begin with you. As I said in the introduction, Vice President Biden's trip was meant to actually reassure Israelis of U.S. commitment to its strong bilateral relationship, to its security, to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. Where do U.S.-Israel relations stand now in light of this diplomatic uproar?
I think it's a crisis in U.S.-Israeli relations. There have been many such crises in the past, but it dramatizes a deep misunderstanding between the U.S. government and the government of Israel about the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Unfortunately, over the years, this deep, profound alliance has been interpreted by the government of Israel, many governments, as a U.S. policy of deferring to Israeli policy. And all too often we have done that. And unless the U.S. reacts in a way that reflects U.S. interests to this latest rebuff, the announcement that many new units will be built in East Jerusalem, this relationship is at risk. It also reflects, I think, a policy of the Netanyahu government to resist the kinds of territorial compromises that will be necessary to create a two-state peace. it is essential that there be a shared Jerusalem and a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. The Netanyahu government categorically rejects that reality, and I think its decision to continue settlement building, notwithstanding strong U.S. criticism, is a symptom of that.
Turning to you, Ziad Asali, for your reaction, because, of course, as Ambassador Wilcox said, he believes this is symptomatic of a deep misunderstanding between the United States and Israel. Of course, we should acknowledge that Prime Minister Netanyahu apologized for the timing of this announcement, more so than the actual substance. So where do things stand in your view?
Not in a very good place. I agree with Ambassador Wilcox that there is a challenge now to the relations, although we all agree and understand that the relation between Israel and the United States is strategic. However, that does not mean that the United States supports every Israeli government, especially when it comes to defying the national interest of the United States. The national interest of the United States, as expressed by President Bush and now President Obama, is very clear. It's for a two-state solution, which means a compromise on land is very much in the national interest of the United States. The issue of the settlements has always been a major irritant, and it seems to me that the government of Israel is yet again testing one more administration during one significant diplomat's visit to score a point on this issue. There is a saying in Arabic that roughly translates into this: if you did know, be a catastrophe, but if you did not know, the catastrophe would be greater. So this applies to Netanyahu. Either he should have known or he did know. In both situations, that puts him at a difficult spot politically with the United States, and it probably has justly generated a lot of criticism in Israel. This has to be clarified, and this eventually has to be resolved in Israel. It's not enough to talk about the timing. Taking away Jerusalem, the ultimate symbol in the conflict, off the table by just declaring it under Israeli conflict and having the authorities, even local authorities, behave like this, leaves us with a major setback for the two-state solution, and the only real beneficiaries are extremists on both sides.
Turning back to you, Ambassador Wilcox, let's take a look at Prime Minister Netanyahu's dilemma. As Ziad Asali said, it's a catastrophe either way, whether he knew or didn't know. It's important that a Prime Minister takes responsibility, and of course he did issue an apology, but let's get to the deeper issue about the building in East Jerusalem, part of final status negotiations. What do you think is going on now inside the Israeli government? Because we know there are certainly differences. There are hardline ministers, such as the Interior Minister, who made this announcement. What do you think is going on right now?
Well, Israel is a deeply divided country which is still searching for its real identity. The majority of Israelis, according to many public opinion polls, are pragmatic. They are quite aware of the threat that the Israeli occupation and settlement policy in the West Bank poses to Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state. Israeli governments, however, have taken a harder line because of the dysfunctional nature of Israeli politics. I don't believe that the Netanyahu government genuinely seeks a two-state peace solution of a kind that would be acceptable to the Palestinians nor the rest of the world. That is why they have aggressively continued settlement building to claim total control and possession of East Jerusalem. They think they can prevail. It is a most unrealistic policy historically, and a very dangerous one for Israel's future, not to mention the danger it poses to American national security interests. Unfortunately, the U.S. has not made it clear enough its opposition to occupation and settlement, and it has led Israeli politicians to believe that we don't care, that we're not serious about our own interests, and that they can act with impunity. That must change if the U.S. is going to be successful in brokering peace between these two societies.
Do you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is likely to walk back from this decision, as the Palestinians would like, and I assume the United States would like as well? What are the prospects in order to restore some semblance of confidence?
The prospects are not good if we pursue this as business as usual. This provocation, which the leading Israeli daily Haaretz called pouring fuel on the fire, is not unprecedented. Announcements of new settlement building have greeted many American envoys as they arrive in Israel. Netanyahu, I think, needs to understand more clearly that in the long run, this tight, intimate alliance between the U.S. and Israel will not prosper, indeed will not survive, unless it becomes more of a two-way street that reflects not only Israeli interests, but American interests. But Netanyahu is unlikely to heed that lesson unless our leaders make that reality much more clear than they have in the past.
Before I turn to Dr. Asali, a very quick follow-up. Does Prime Minister Netanyahu think his coalition may fall if he doesn't assuage or somehow accommodate the hardline ministers that seem to want to sabotage the talks? Is this his deep-seated fear, perhaps?
He's worried about that because the balance of power in his coalition lie with the Messianic Jews, the settler parties, and the ideological right wing and other religious parties. My own view is that if Netanyahu wants to, he can lead, that the Israeli public would support him if he commits Israel to a genuine peace. I think that he may not have the vision and the imagination to realize that, and indeed he fears for the safety of his coalition if he concedes to American objections to further settlement building.
You're listening to Encounter on VOA News Now. My guests are Dr. Ziad Asali, president of the American Task Force on Palestine, a Washington-based nonprofit organization dedicated to a two-state solution in the Middle East, and Ambassador Philip Wilcox, from whom you just heard. He's president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, an organization devoted to fostering peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And we're discussing prospects for indirect Israeli-Palestinian peace talks in the aftermath of U.S. Vice President Joe Biden's trip to the region. This is a reminder that you can listen to Encounter online as a podcast. Please visit our website, voanews.com, and click on podcasts. Turning to you, Ziad Asali, I'd like to get your take on what's going on within the Israeli government, whether this represents, a difficulty in coming to terms with talks with the Palestinians despite the rhetoric, or is Prime Minister Netanyahu fearful that his coalition, which depends on many hardline ministers, will fall apart? What's going on?
Well, I think no matter what the analysis is, it is a political mistake on two levels. I think on balance it will weaken the standing of the right-wing rejectionist segment in the Israeli society as represented in government, even at the cabinet level. The other political part of the mistake, I think, is the relation with the United States. Snubbing somebody who is an acknowledged friend of Israel for decades and who went for a love fest visit with Israel so publicly cannot bode well for the standing of the Israeli political leadership right now in Washington, no matter what. So there is this reality. How it will impact itself on the position of the Israeli government is still an open question. It depends on the positions taken by the United States. It depends on what the Israeli public decides after listening to all parties. And then, of course, this will reflect on the coalition. Netanyahu himself has really nothing much to worry about. The worst that can happen to him is to unload some of the extreme right-wing smaller parties and join forces with Kadima and Zipi Livni. And then he would still be in charge and would have a wider coalition to move forward.
But would she accept that?
Well, it depends on the terms. It has always depended on the terms. It will mean, for the rest of us, at least those who look at it by what we know publicly, is that it will mean that he would have to cross that threshold of genuinely accepting a two-state solution and accepting that it will lead to genuine negotiations with the Palestinians and that the United States can and would live with. In fact, it would insist upon.
And before I turn to Ambassador Wilcox, as a Palestinian yourself and with your contacts with the Palestinians, particularly Abu Mazen, President Mahmoud Abbas, what do you think is going on, and will they overlook, this announcement and continue with their indirect talks? What do you think is going to happen in the coming weeks?
Okay. I think it is likely that negotiations will resume. Abu Mazen did not enjoy being on top of that non-negotiations tree, which made him irrelevant. He is supposed to be negotiating. That is his role. So negotiators were not negotiating in Palestine, and resistors were not resisting. A very odd contradiction even internally in these camps. So negotiations will resume. What would be positive in this for Abu Mazen is the position of the United States. I think the United States now appreciates more significantly what the settlement issue is about and how it needs to deal with it more forthrightly rather than fudge it. And I think he expects, indeed I think it's likely that the United States will have to face up to the implications of expansion of the settlements while you're talking about a two-state solution. And hence the proximity talks will probably start and will lead to a more direct talks. And we will also see what the changes in Israel politics will dictate. So there are several variables. If we're optimistic, we think we may just reasonably soon start back on the right track.
Ambassador Wilcox, George Mitchell, the U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East, is on his way next week. What do you expect him to be doing? How do you see his challenges in light of what has happened?
I think the challenge of creating a two-state peace agreement through bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiations are almost nil. The playing field is not level. Israel is an occupying power. Israel is a traditional ally of the United States. It would be extraordinarily difficult in the course of bilateral negotiations for any Israeli government to take those strategic decisions which are necessary to remove the majority of the settlements, to agree to a shared Jerusalem, and to transform an Israeli policy now which has continued for 40 years since the 1967 war. If I'm correct, I hope I'm not, the logic leads to the conclusion that unless the United States adopts its own policy and offers it to the parties that addresses the real issues of land, settlement, borders, refugees, Jerusalem, and security, I don't believe that those two sides have the capability of working this out in an equitable way.
And do you see that forthcoming?
That's the big question. George Mitchell is a superb negotiator, a very wise, experienced man. I believe, but I certainly don't know, that at some stage Mitchell is going to start introducing American ideas, specific ideas about how to resolve these difficult final status issues. Whether he will do that on a piecemeal basis to bridge positions which will be deeply divided, to break stalemates on those issues, or whether he will offer an integrated package, I don't know. I would recommend the latter as a way of reversing this very, very intractable conflict.
Turning back to you, Dr. Asali, many analysts have said that, here we are talking about indirect peace talks. The Israelis and Palestinians have been sitting together over the past decade talking directly. So while we're hailing this possibility as a breakthrough, it is a limited one in the context, but nonetheless, because of the way relations have deteriorated over the last year or so, I guess we have to at least be thankful for this indirect talk, which we hope will lead to direct talks. But notwithstanding the many impediments that Ambassador Wilcox referred to, particularly within Israeli politics, what about some of the very, very real sense of insecurity that Israel, feels vis-a-vis the Arab world, vis-a-vis the resurgence of Iran in the region, and they are looking for gestures. The United States has asked some of the Arab states to offer some real concrete gestures toward Israel. Have you seen any of that? And what would they be? Do you think, and would they make a difference in Israel's posture?
First off, I think the United States is the indispensable partner for peace. There is no possibility of peace if the United States is not engaged and committed and active. So there's that. The other is the issue of timing. I think when the time comes, the statement I just said means that the United States will have to be very active to get to the final agreement, and that may very well be a package at the proper time. There will be no such package immediately. I think it's safe to say that we'll go back gradually, proximity talks, and et cetera, and lining up allies in the region in answer to the issue of the involvement of other Arab governments. That will take time. In the meantime, if no progress is made, things will absolutely go down south. That is why it is so imperative to have improvement on the ground as we have the year 2010 unfold, to have improvements on the ground so that the Palestinian people have themselves a sense that something positive has happened. Hence comes the issue of the state building and institution building project that is being adopted by the Palestinian Authority, Prime Minister Fayyad, and by the United States and the international community. So this will give people the opinion to test each other on cooperation. This will be another test for the Netanyahu government because it is the occupying power. It can make this project unfold realistically and have the Palestinians build their institutions and their state, or it can, of course, thwart it. Another task for the United States to be involved with till we reach the political agreement.
Turning back to you, Ambassador Wilcox, even if the indirect talks get off between the Palestinians and Israelis, we still have Gaza, Hamas-controlled Gaza. So even if all goes well, what about the fact that the Palestinians are divided, and how does this complicate talks going forward?
It's a huge problem, often overlooked. I doubt that any Israeli government, however dovish, would submit to a peace agreement with only part of the Palestinian political leadership. Palestinian reunification is a critical need for a two-state peace agreement, and that's very difficult to achieve. It has to be part of a broader American strategy. I don't know what our strategy is at the moment, but I think we have kicked that issue down the road and haven't confronted it. But we'll have to. For negotiations to prosper, there has to be a single Palestinian government, a single Palestinian authority. The process of bilateral negotiations and confidence building has been at the heart of U.S. policy now for 20 years. And there have been lots of negotiations and repeated efforts to persuade both sides to cease acts which undermine confidence and trust. All of those efforts have failed. And so I'm not optimistic that yet another effort along those lines is going to succeed. And at some stage, sooner than later, I hope, the United States is going to have to assert itself more energetically. And it's going to have to address both the Israeli and Palestinian publics, because ultimately they will decide. U.S. cannot impose peace. We must persuade those two communities that they're in deep trouble, that we want to use our power and our influence to help rescue them, and that we also have profound interests of our own. We have to move and change public opinion in both communities. That's a huge task. It may be presumptuous, but unless we can do that, I don't see that process taking place spontaneously. We can no longer say that the U.S. cannot want peace more than the parties themselves. Peace between Israel and Palestine and the creation of two states is a strategic interest for the United States.
Very well put. And for the last word, let me turn to you, Dr. Asali, especially addressing what Ambassador Wilcox said, particularly with respect to the need for a unified Palestinian entity for negotiations to prosper. I mean, this is certainly a challenge. If the Palestinians were unified, it would be a challenge. But given the Gaza is now run by Hamas and the Palestinian Authority oversees the West Bank, how do you see this going forward? Should there be and can there be reunification?
There are clearly serious problems, ideological and political and practical. But let us separate two things: the process of negotiations and a potential agreement from its acceptance and implementation by both sides. I think at some point in time we have to assume that the Palestinian people have to vote. They have to vote for their own government, and they have to vote on the final agreement. And that would necessitate a change of the present system. That is where we need for the conversation to be widened inside of Israel, to understand that the real threats to Israel are regional and not Palestinian. The evolving landscape, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., and Syria, all that is a serious threat to Israel. So resolving the Palestinian issue would have to be conceived by the Israeli public and reflected in their government as serving the national interest of Israel. This is where we arrive at a situation where, the public discourse is important, and arguments to the Palestinians and the Israelis have to be towards, reaching this compromise, because the region is facing a new reality that it did not exist 10 years ago. And I think the prospects for that are exactly what is driving the United States policy.
And once again, are you optimistic that the Palestinians can, in fact, come together? Or will this, the Hamas split continue?
Okay, I think there is no possibility for Gaza to be an independent anything. It has nothing to make it stand alone. So at some point in time, Gaza would have to be somewhere. The Egyptians don't want it, the Israelis don't want it, so it can only go back to the Palestinians. How that is done is the challenge of the politicians of the time, and it is hoped that the Gaza people, as they witness what is happening in improvement on the ground in the West Bank, that continues. And we hope also that the United States and Israel understand that the humanitarian disaster in Gaza is playing into the wrong hands, and keeping the crossings and preventing reconstruction are just wrong things that have to be corrected in order for us to arrive at a point in time where we have meaningful elections and where we have a unified Palestinian situation which can deliver on the agreements that they eventually... That's why I'll go back to the timing. Timing is important. We need time to resolve these issues. And in the meantime, we cannot waste time. We have to do something very positive, like the state-building exercise in the West Bank.
And as we said, U.S. Envoy George Mitchell is on his way to the Middle East next week, and we'll be monitoring those events. I'm afraid that's all the time we have on this edition of Encounter. I'd like to thank my guests, Dr. Ziad Asali, President of the American Task Force on Palestine, and Ambassador Philip Wilcox, President of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you both for coming in and sharing your insights and analysis.
Thank you.
Encounter was produced in Washington. Thanks to Anna Zalewski for booking our guests. Our engineer was Brian Marcoulier. I'm Carol Castiel. Join me again next week for another Encounter on the Voice of America.
Encounter on VOA News Now. Encounter on VOA News Now brought together advocates and opponents debating the critical issues of our time in a freewheeling, no-holds-barred discussion of fact and opinion. Your host was Carol Castiel. Join us again next week for another Encounter on VOA News Now.